Here's my scary true story about the time my friends and I visited the abandoned insane asylum. As I remember it, the insane asylum was a husk of misery, its walls groaning with the weight of the darkness trapped inside. The place loomed like a grave marker, its jagged outline barely visible against the inky sky. We had heard the stories for years, of the screams that never stopped, of the twisted experiments conducted on the patients, and of the shadows that moved even when no one was there. It was the perfect place for what we were planning. Angel, Corbin, Carlos, and I, Brian, were young and stupid enough to believe that taking acid in such a place would grant us a direct line to the spirit world. We thought we were chasing adventure, something wild and unforgettable. None of us could have imagined the nightmare waiting for us. By the time we reached the asylum, the acid had started to creep in. The forest around us was alive, the trees stretching and curling like they wanted to swallow the car. Every shadow seemed to blink. Every rustle of leaves sounded like whispers. But the real madness began when we stepped inside. The air inside the asylum was thick, heavy with a damp, earthy rot. Our flashlights cast distorted beams that seemed to twist and bend like liquid, making the graffiti-covered walls ripple and flow. The ground beneath us felt soft and spongy, as if we were walking on skin. "This is insane," Corbin said, his voice already trembling as his pupils blew wide. The acid had fully hit now. Everything pulsed with a sickly glow, and colors dripped and smeared like wet paint. The hallway ahead seemed to stretch forever, then snap back like a rubber band, and the faint echoes of our footsteps sounded like they were coming from just behind us. We found an old treatment room on the second floor, its metal gurneys rusted and pitted. The restraints hung limply, their leather straps cracked and stained. I could see faint trails of something dark running down the walls, shimmering like oil slicks. "Set up the board," Angel said, his voice warbling as if it were underwater. Corbin placed the Ouija board on the floor, and we sat around it. The acid was working overtime now, twisting everything into surreal, almost unbearable clarity. The letters on the board seemed to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. The candle Carlos lit was impossibly bright, its flame a kaleidoscope of colors that cast shadows that danced and writhed. The planchette was ice cold under our fingers, a sensation so sharp it felt like it was sinking into my skin. Angel leaned forward, his face contorting strangely under the flickering light. "Is there anyone here with us?" he asked. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the planchette jerked violently, sending shock waves up my arm that felt like lightning. It slid to yes, the sound of it scraping across the board echoing far too loudly. The air changed. It felt thicker, heavier, and colder, as if the atmosphere had been sucked out and replaced with something else, something wrong. "What's your name?" Carlos asked, his voice slurring as if his tongue had gone numb. The planchette began to move again, this time slowly, deliberately, spelling out WHISTLER. Almost immediately we heard it, a soft haunting whistle that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The tune was mournful, a dirge that seemed to burrow into my skull. I could see it, feel it, sharp, jagged notes slicing through the air like shards of glass. I did. The air was... "Do you feel that?" Angel whispered, his eyes darting around the room. I did. The air was alive, rippling like water, and the walls seemed to breathe, exhaling cold drafts that smelled like mold and something metallic. The shadows around us thickened, growing darker, heavier, until they felt like they were pressing against my skin. Then we saw him. He stepped out of the shadows, his gaunt form barely solid. His skin was stretched tight over his bones, his eyes sunken pits of darkness. His grin was impossibly wide, teeth sharp and yellowed. But the worst part was his movement, jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. The whistle stopped, and the room was filled with a low, wet, gurgling sound. "Why are you here?" Corbin asked, his voice cracking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, the shadows around him began to writhe, growing tendrils that slithered across the floor toward us. I could see them clearly now, blacker than the void, their edges jagged and shifting. The acid warped everything, making it unbearable. The shadows hissed and snapped, their movements synchronized with the pulsating walls. The faces in the graffiti twisted into grotesque masks, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams. Then the screaming started. It was a woman's voice, high-pitched and raw, as if her throat was being ripped apart. She appeared in the corner of the room, her body charred and blistered, her hair hanging in burned clumps. Her eyes were empty sockets, yet they bore into me as if she could see everything. "Help me," she wailed, her voice cracking. The acid made every detail too sharp, too real. Her skin bubbled and oozed, and the smell of burning flesh filled the room. I gagged, the stench so overpowering that it felt like it was inside me, coating my lungs. From the darkness a growl rumbled. The shadows thickened, merging into a hulking form. Its yellow eyes burned like molten gold, and its body was a nightmare of scars, matted fur, and claws that scraped the floor. It roared, the sound shaking the walls and vibrating through my bones. The acid heightened everything. I could feel the roar in my teeth, in my chest, like it was tearing me apart from the inside. The shadows seemed to wrap around us, pulling, constricting. Then it appeared, the final figure cloaked in shadow. Its eyes burned red, twin suns in the darkness. Its grin stretched wide, revealing rows of jagged, rotting teeth. This was no ghost, no tortured soul. This was something ancient, something evil, something that should never have been seen. "You don't belong here," it said, its voice a symphony of growls, whispers, and screams. The walls began to bleed, thick, black sludge pouring from the cracks. The air was filled with the sound of insects, their legs skittering across the floor and over my skin. I tried to scream, but my voice was gone, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The acid turned everything into a grotesque, surreal nightmare. The walls pulsed like veins, the faces in the graffiti twisted into demonic visages, and the shadows wrapped around me like cold, slimy tentacles. Somehow we ran. The asylum blurred around us, the hallways stretching and warping. The growls and whistles followed, echoing in my mind like a chorus of doom. We burst outside, gasping for air. But the forest was wrong now. The trees loomed larger, their branches twisting into skeletal arms. The whispers followed us, growing louder, mocking us. We never spoke of that night again, but the scars remain. Sometimes I still hear the whistle in my dreams, soft and mournful. And when I wake, I swear I can feel those shadows, waiting, just out of sight.